CSS will help you, it describes your web page and the user interface. Forget anything colors, layout, fonts, but you can use it to make this layout look the same on a phone or as on a massive TV, or more recently they had I think it was about 2 years ago, there was a spec for doing it on round display, so like on a watch, so you can detect if it's on a round display and adjust your interface to fit it. The main thing about CSS, it separates the presentation from the content. So say the content is the massive part of the web, so you say you've got hundreds of pages. You can have one CSS page to change them all, whereas at some point in the web, I think maybe probably around 98, 99, you had a lot of mix of style and content, so editing the style of your pages was a pain. So CSS makes that a lot easier. CSS rule, so as I said, CSS is made up of rules. A typical rule is made up of a selector, a property, and a value. So that's pretty much all CSS. It's lots of these declarations and rules. They might look like something like this. So this selects all the divs, which is a HTML construct, and gives it a border with 1 pixel, which is dashed in red. So that's a typical selector. That's quite a simple one. You can combine them. This one, div plus div, is saying every div after another div. Give it these properties, so you can add more than one property. So I'm making it the background color purple, changing the font family, changing the margin. So this actually is a shorthand margin. So I'm saying the top margin 0, left and right margin 0, and margin of 1 EM underneath. So that's the basic gist of CSS. So you've got lots of rules like that. So I said at the beginning, PostCSS is giving CSS an upgrade. So why does it even need an upgrade? Well, you haven't got a parent selector, which if you don't know what it is, you'll know when you try and use it, because you can't select something. You can only select the bottom, the child elements. You can't select the parent of the, like say for example, something, if you want to select things with a certain element inside them, you usually have to fall back on JavaScript. There's no variables, no functions. The cascading part of CSS can trip people up sometimes, especially if you don't know how it's working. So certain rules can override other rules. It can be hard to maintain for this reason, and it's quite common to have a big gigantic CSS file. Somebody comes in to change it, and they've never seen it before, so they just throw the rules on the bottom, and that solves a lot of the problems. It's actually been around for 20 years, so it was first proposed in 1994. So I won't pronounce his name, but he worked with Tim Berners-Lee at the birth of the web, and he came up with the proposal for CSS. It was one document in 1996, another one in 1997, and then they started saying, splitting out into lots of different modules. But it took a long time for browsers to actually support CSS consistently. And this is the stat I found, one of the first ones to actually support. This was actually the first version of CSS1, was a really widespread used browser, IE5 on the Mac. It had 99% support of CSS1, but because all the other browsers didn't handle it, it was pretty much it's a bit of like a buggy browser because it supports it and nothing else does. A poster child for the sort of separation of style and content is CSS Zen Garden. This was like one page and one set of HTML, and they initially released it with like 4 different CSS files, so you could change the layout of the page completely just with the CSS. I think they ended up with 34 different ones, and they could look completely different based on just a different CSS, even though the content was the same. Between 2004 and 2011, it was a complete mess. This CSS 2.1 went back and forth from being implemented and being not being proposed and approved and proposed and approved. And I think what they were doing here is they were writing the specs before they were implemented, whereas CSS 2.1 they they looked at the browser implementations and put it into the spec. So I think that's kind of the trend that they've gone with at the moment. It's not just write the spec and you browser vendors implement it. It's like the browsers will also implement something and then it will get moved into the spec as it's used. I think this mess here is probably part of the reason these preprocessors like Sass were created. So I'll come back to that in a minute. But for now, if you're looking at a CSS property or even HTML and you want to use it, I tend to go straight to can I use, look at what percentage of the world has it available in their browsers, and then make a judgment on if I can actually use it or not. So building websites itself has changed quite a bit. In the early days we used tables. If you still write any HTML emails, you're probably still writing tables. Then we moved to like floating layouts, which were quite a bit of a pain. And before we had this thing called box border, we had to take into account the padding when we were measuring the width of things. So we'd say something was 100 pixels wide until you added some padding on it and it was a bit extra. And it meant that certain layouts were really impossible to do. So this sort of gets rid of that. So instead of it, an element being 100 pixels wide plus the padding's is sort of ignored in the width of the thing, which is handy. All these horrible reasons and the problems with CSS are the reasons why a lot of people will sort of lean on libraries for all the CSS. So things like Bootstrap. So Bootstrap all the things, and it's still going. They've come out with a Bootstrap Studio, which is sort of like an IDE type thing for Bootstrap, so you can drag and drop. So if you still want to use that, there's nothing wrong with it. You can use Bootstrap Studio. So as I said, in 2005, preprocessors came around. Sass came out of the Ruby community, still going. Less also came 4 years later. There's another one, the Stylus, which was pretty similar. They just got rid of all the semicolons and braces. I don't think there's that much difference. It's still around, but I'd say it's on life support. It's not really being maintained. There's a few more interesting ones called Rework and Myth, which were looking more at the implementing the current spec rather than sort of Sass has its own sort of proprietary syntax for writing CSS. Unfortunately, both of those have been abandoned as well. But and there's a good talk by Carolina. She kind of goes through this history quite well. I won't go into it anymore. But the interesting one there is Myth, which is sort of similar to what I'm going to show you with PostCSS later. So the good bits, you get all the variables that you didn't have, so you can have a variable for colors, spacing, heights and widths and things like that, and functions to do. So if we want to have a function that will generate some code for us, so we don't have to repeat ourselves, so we're not having to copy and paste rules all over the place. We can just use a function to do it. You got real math. I mean, it's not so much of a problem now, but when Sass was started, it was difficult to do math in your CSS. You had to kind of do pre-processing steps. You could start splitting up your files, so you didn't have one gigantic CSS file, and you could have it split into what they call partial views. So, and then at build time, you combine them into one, and you can handle it that way. So it increases your efficiency when you're writing CSS, so it's a bit easier. The bad parts, as with any abstraction, it can be bad. Obviously, it makes your life easier. It encourages some antipatterns. For the most part, you could solve these by looking at the CSS that your preprocessor generated, but that didn't always happen, so it can cause some difficult problems, which made it a bit harder to debug because you've got an abstraction on top of the CSS it generates in the end. And when you come to sort of trace it through, it's not that easy. And it was only 2013 when they added source map support, so you could actually look at your CSS in the browser and trace it back to the Sass file. But that's just recently. Also, it's quite inflexible, and it's because it's been around. Well, especially Sass, it's been around since like 2005. It's quite a monolithic build tool, and it's been quite difficult to change anything now because so many people rely on it. So I thought the answer was PostCSS, or one of the answers. Like I said, there's a few other ones that come before. What's different about PostCSS? It's a tool to transform CSS with JavaScript. I think Sass uses Ruby, and there's a libsass, which is also a library that will do it for you. So it enabled an ecosystem of plugins. So rather than being one monolithic app, you've got lots of little tiny plugins which do one thing really well. It's actually not very useful on its own. It's pretty much just a dumb pipe. The name actually comes from it being, what comes after Sass, after other preprocessor, because I originally thought, oh, is it a post-processor or a pre-processor? It doesn't really matter that much. That's why all these bands, that's like post-punk, post-rock, post-grunge, post-hardcore, and Nickelback or shit. And who made it? This guy, Andrei Sitnik from Evil Martians, which I think is his own business, which I thought was hilarious. He does a few plugins. The big one is Auto Prefixer, which I'll show you in a second. How does it actually work? Well, you put your CSS in, it parses it, it goes through another plugin, could be any number in here. It stringifies the results, so basically turns it back into CSS. So at this point, the parser's turning it into an abstract syntax tree, which means these plugins can handle it without having to like deal with text. It's like basically a node, a tree of nodes, and then at the end you get your new CSS. So each of these points, it could be changing the CSS or potentially fixing it or removing things. So the end result, it'll be CSS that's gone through this pipeline that's been changed somehow. Or in some instance, I'll show you, it might not have changed it. You can use it in different ways. So what's better about this? Some of the tests they've done it is faster because it's there's less going on, and it's speed-wise they've found it's a bit faster in some cases. The modularity part of it is the big selling point for me. How do you start using it? PostCSS.org. They've got a CLI tool. It will integrate with any of your task runners. I tend to use Gulp. It's a bit easier, but it'll work with any of them. But don't do what I did. Don't try to replicate Sass. And also because what I did, I found a CSS framework I really liked. So I was looking for one that didn't have that much JavaScript in it. And I was like, oh, that's really nice. Oh, it uses Sass. I'll open an issue. And it was port to PostCSS. Tried it myself. It didn't work because I tried to replicate Sass. They have some plugins that they call Sass-like, but Sass-like enough that it's not Sass. So yeah, the plugin order can be important. Some plugins are better together, and some are no longer maintained. Like there's hundreds of them, so people build them and then don't maintain them. So that's important. The big ones are I think you can actually use with Sass now. You might already be using it. It's Auto Prefixer, so that'll handle vendor prefixes, so you can add and remove ones as they're needed. So you can use it based on the stats from can I use. So you can say I'm only interested in the last two browser versions, so only put prefixes in for those browsers. So that's where, or you can use this browser list plugin to say, oh, actually only give me the ones that have over 1% market share and are the last two versions. So you can change this to like country as well. So I'm only interested in what the browser usage is in the UK is if the website's targeting that. One I really like is CSS Next because it gives you all these nice features of CSS that are not yet supported, but you can write them in CSS, and PostCSS can transpile it into CSS, which the browsers will understand. So a lot of these it's different from Sass because these are eventually going to end up in CSS, where Sass in reality is not going to, it's never going to be in, it's always going to be in your build tool. So as these, like custom properties, is basically variables. I'll show that in a second. Then you can use import to inline your imports just like you would in Sass. You can minify them. There's lots of other plugins available, but I've just picked out a handful. I tend to focus on the ones that mean you don't have to use some custom syntax that's never actually going to make sense in CSS, even if it's, you know, like future CSS. You can write your own plugins as well. You can use it to help you maintain your CSS, so things like naming conventions, folder structure. There's a few there, I won't go through them all. There's lots of different, there's a lot of things happening right now and making CSS more maintainable. These are some of the good ones, I think. Endurance CSS, I quite like. It's this guy, Ben Frayne. He's writing sort of quite complex web apps for Bet365, and he's put it through, I think he's using PostCSS, and he's doing a lot of other things methodology-wise to make it easier. The big one I like, this is a PostCSS plugin which will help link your CSS, so it make it follow certain rules. It can pick out potential bugs and sort of report them in your ID as you're writing it. And you can, for example, this is the BEM naming convention, so it's like hyphens in certain places and parent and child components, so it can enforce the naming convention in your files. The future of CSS looks good. There's a lot going on right now. Like I say, CSS variables are the big one. So they do look a bit weird, but I think you'll just get used to them. And the good thing about them, you can change them at runtime. These will exist in your browser. So that makes theming really easy. So if I wanted to change the accent color to purple or something, I'll just change it there and it will change it everywhere else because I'm just using a variable. And colors as well, you can do a lot with colors. So I can like take my accent color, make it a bit lighter, saturate it a little bit. And I've got lots of different color functions that I can just use in the browser. Obviously these don't exist in the browser right now, but I can use them in my CSS and then use PostCSS to change it into a real color. So it's still usable right now. Grid layout, for example, here I haven't checked out yet, but that's going to be the next big one, I think. Same with progressive enhancement. It's a bit difficult to use right now because it gets a bit tricky with which things support the @supports rule. So you've got like a bit of a grid of does this one actually have the @support rule, and how can you detect if it has that rule? It'll be handy soon. Web components are big as well, and the only thing I think I want you to take out of this is that you should be using Flexbox if you aren't already. 97% of the globe use it. Obviously you have a problem with IE, but you can use it partial support. It makes your layout so much easier. And if you want, you can use a nice little game called Flexbox Froggy to learn it. So you basically like change the properties and it'll move these frogs onto the lily pads so that they move around, and you can say, oh, this red one will go over here if I make it'd be like align cell flex send. So this is flex send. There's different rules for it, but it makes it very easy to learn. So that's all I want to talk to you about. Thank you.